Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Alex Lederman. I am Israel Policy Forum's Senior Policy Associate, and I want to welcome those of you who are returning to us today, as well as those of you who are here for the first time. Before we begin, a big thank you to Israel Policy Forum supporters. Our work, including today's program, is made possible by you. Israel Policy Forum relies on donors like you to produce free expert analysis and informational content on Israeli-Palestinian affairs. If you enjoy Israel Policy Forum's webinars but don't yet support the organization's work, please do so by visiting israelpolicyforum.org/support to make a tax-deductible donation. Now on to today's program. We are here today to discuss the seventh meeting that took place yesterday between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Donald Trump since Trump returned to the presidency over a year ago. This meeting was interesting for several reasons, including a far lower media footprint than previous ones, with the focus being events in Gaza, as well as potential for an escalation with Iran, and ongoing negotiations between the US and the Islamic Republic. Joining me today are three of my colleagues on the policy team, who I am delighted to introduce. We have Rachel Brandenburg, our Washington Managing Director and Senior Policy Analyst, Michael Koplow, our Chief Policy Officer, and Dan Rothem, our Senior Policy Analyst based in Israel. And before we get started, I want to encourage all of you to participate in the conversation by putting your questions in the Q&A box below. I'm going to hopefully get to as many as possible in the second half of the hour. And to get started, I'm going to turn to you, Rachel, first to get us going. Yesterday on Twitter, you commented on the photo that was going around the media that was published after the meeting between Bibi and Trump, which included Bibi and Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner and a couple others around this table, and they were smiling and shaking hands. And you suggested that it possibly was obscuring maybe a less convivial or congenial discussion that had taken place behind closed doors or while the camera's away. Obviously, the US administration and the Israeli government have an interest in displaying close coordination, but clearly there are some divergences on several of the key issues here. So what's your impression of where things stand following the meeting?
Thanks, Alex. Having worked in government, I'm always skeptical of photos and even most reports. Media never really gets the full scoop. Even the best journalists often aren't told the full story. And this meeting in particular was an interesting one. It appeared as an observer that Trump came to town, sort of said, "I'm going to come talk." I'm sorry, Prime Minister Netanyahu told President Trump, "I'm going to come talk to you about Iran," as opposed to President Trump inviting him for some larger reason. And even going in, we've seen some divergence between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu on the direction they want to go in Iran. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu has been pretty clear that he doesn't really see value in negotiations. If anything, it's a waste of time. And it's a waste of time in what he views to be a moment of opportunity to go after the Iranian regime, to go after their nuclear program further, to go after their ballistic missile program. They're weaker than they have been, and I think for the Israelis, they want to take advantage of that militarily. For President Trump, he's in a bit of a different position. He walked himself out on a limb during the protests and told the Iranian people help is on the way. This regime cannot do what it's doing, but he hasn't really followed up yet. He's sent a lot of military assets to the region, but he's also started negotiations. So he's using sort of a hug and a punch or a carrot and a stick tactic here, where he is threatening by having all these military assets that he is willing to use force, but he's really trying to conclude a deal. And it's unclear, it was unclear before the meeting, and I think even more so in the statement that Prime Minister Netanyahu released afterwards, whether he thinks that there is any deal that President Trump can conclude that will be good enough for the Israelis. The statement that was released shortly ago today was pretty mealy-mouthed. It was sort of saying, "I came, I listened, we discussed, President Trump wanted to hear from me. He thinks there's potential for a deal, and I'm going to see where that goes." I still don't really think it's possible. But it says to me that Prime Minister Netanyahu is still in a position of feeling the need to be deferential to President Trump, but also not wanting to express full agreement as he heads home.
It seems like one of the main points of divergence between Bibi and Trump when it comes to negotiations with Iran and the potential for a deal is over the scope of the deal, whether it's just going to focus on the nuclear program or whether it's going to address other things like the ballistic missiles, like Iran's proxies. Do you do you see that as the key divergence between Bibi and Trump around the potential for a deal, or do you think that there are potentially other factors at play in terms of why, Trump might be more optimistic about prospects for a deal? Is he just, less ambitious in terms of what the scope of that deal could be?
Sure. I think they have similar views on what an ideal scope would be. I'm not sure they have similar views on what a sufficient deal would be. So, for Prime Minister Netanyahu and for Israel, a deal that does not address all of those things in a very stringent way is not good enough. The JCPOA was not good enough. For Trump, I think he and his team are probably aiming to get a deal that covers as much as they can, but ultimately, what he wants is a win, to be able to walk himself back from the limb of a few weeks ago and say, I accomplished something, I achieved something, whether related to Iran's nuclear program, ballistic missile program. I mean, the more extreme view is regime change, but that takes an amount of investment and effort that I'm not convinced our president, President Trump, wants to invest. Whereas for Prime Minister Netanyahu, this is an existential problem, and it's one on which he has staked his legacy for so many years. The war in July was an opportunity, and I think by many accounts, somewhat of a success in pushing back Iran's nuclear program. But there's this window of opportunity now that he wants to take advantage of. And I just don't think the calculus is the same for the United States and for Israel on that.
Interesting. I want to turn now to Gaza, which is kind of the other main bucket that was reportedly the focus of this meeting that took place yesterday. Don, turning to you, heading into next week, which is going to be the inaugural meeting of the Board of Peace in Washington, this kind of unusual multinational institution that Trump has created to oversee the Gaza ceasefire. One of the things that happened during the meeting yesterday between Bibi and Trump, or before the meeting, was Bibi signing on to officially join the Board of Peace. But nonetheless, there's plenty that is in Trump's vision for Gaza that is at odds with the Israeli government stance, including a horizon for Palestinian statehood, which is explicitly spelled out in Trump's 20-point plan. Meanwhile, there are also rumors that Israel could be even eyeing a return to fighting against Hamas, going west of the Yellow Line, and now that there are no more hostages, potentially escalating and breaking the ceasefire. Do you see these two sides, the US and Israel, coordinating closely on Gaza? And how do you think that they are succeeding in navigating these gaps based on what we've heard coming out of this meeting that took place yesterday?
So, first of all, thank you. Good to be here. Look, Trump's approach, and this feeds off of what Rachel outlined in regard to Iran as well, is that basically everything can be traded. And although phase one of his 20-point plan involving hostage release, prisoner swap, humanitarian aid, and an effective end to that war, at least, was difficult. I think both sides were pretty ripe for it. But now, in moving to phase two, the president runs into some protected values, non-negotiables of both Israel and Hamas. And it'll be interesting to see how, he navigates that and the barrier that he is already, and certainly his team is running into. For Israel, Trump is asking for concessions that Israel is interpreting as falling short of security needs and challenging the absolute veto that we see here over movement toward Palestinian sovereignty in the longer future. It triggers key constituencies of Netanyahu's coalition. For Hamas, the demand for disarmament, clashes with the movement's core identity, its national and religious parts. And this is even before issues like withdrawal, IDF withdrawal, early recovery, but like a much more robust early recovery, reconstruction, and also policies elsewhere that are not in the center of the issue, but at least Hamas is attentive to them. Some in the West Bank, but certainly in Jerusalem, Old City, Al-Aqsa, and Ramadan is just around the corner. So before these are addressed, just the issue of disarmament in and of itself is a big challenge. So both sides are playing for time, hoping that something will give. Israel, of course, is very skeptical of Trump's ability to meet mutual objectives, certainly in Iran, also in Gaza, by diplomacy, and is gearing up for war. Although, like strategically, some think that the situation, we've heard this for a while, that the situation in Gaza benefits Israel, divided Gaza, if you would. Politically, it's a very mixed bag for Netanyahu. He can claim holding 60%, having all the captives out, holding 60% of the strip. But the remaining 40% have mission incomplete, not to mention mission failure. We're not there yet, maybe, but mission incomplete splashed all over it. And this is election season, not formally, but effectively. So this is a mixed bag for him. Trump certainly wants to pursue a deal with Hamas for disarmament and for progress, but he'll find that it's very difficult to do. And then Netanyahu's wish to resume the fighting will be tested.
Related to the point on disarmament, I just want to briefly mention today we published a report that you co-authored with Celine Touboul from the Economic Cooperation Foundation entitled Disarming Hamas, a Framework for Lasting Security. There's a link in the chat, and we go into various options, various theoretical options for disarming the terror group, and what an option for what a realistic pathway to doing so would be. So I encourage you to check that report out. We'll have more programming about it in the coming weeks. I want to turn to you, Michael, now to discuss an issue that I think has really fallen under the radar quite a bit, both in Israel's strategic, but both in the discussions in Israel and in kind of the noise surrounding U.S.-Israel relations. Your column today focused on a series of decisions that the Security Cabinet made on Sunday pertaining to the West Bank, which sound really bureaucratic when you look at what actually was discussed or what decisions were made. But actually, these resolutions were huge steps forward for West Bank annexation. And according to Axios, Trump has since reiterated his opposition to West Bank annexation, which of course could scuttle a lot of what he hopes to achieve in Gaza. So do you think that this was something that was discussed yesterday? And what do you think? Do you think that the administration is taking it seriously? Are there any indications that Netanyahu or that Trump brought this up with Bibi? How do you see this playing out in the coming weeks?
We have no way of knowing if they discussed it yesterday. It certainly wasn't mentioned by the president in his Truth Social post afterward, and Prime Minister Netanyahu's very, very brief and concise statement didn't mention it either. So we have no way of knowing. But it is a big deal, and if it wasn't discussed yesterday, it's going to come up down the road. So since October 7th, of course, the Israeli government has advanced all sorts of moves inside of the West Bank that are meant to put more Israelis in the territory, in more places in the territory. And as Defense Minister Israel Katz and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich said on Sunday, kill any future possibility of a Palestinian state. Our dear friend and former colleague Shira Efron has an article in Foreign Affairs today that does a good job of detailing what's gone on over the last few years. But what happened on Sunday isn't just more of the same. I think it's easy to look at it and say, all right, well, the Israeli government, of course, they're committed to building inside of the West Bank, and so they're now just trying to make it easier to do that, removing red tape. It all sounds very bureaucratic and technical. But what the government did on Sunday is a big deal for two reasons. First of all, it isn't just a question of removing bureaucratic hurdles for Israeli Jews who want to live in the West Bank. It's a series of measures designed not just to make it easier, but to mirror the process inside of Israel. So the way in which you would go about building a house inside of Israel, the idea is to basically make the process inside of the West Bank the same. And also to make it easier to buy land inside of the West Bank by doing it directly, by publishing who owns it, which means in many cases, publishing the names of Palestinian landowners and then making them vulnerable to all sorts of pressure to sell to Israelis. That's not the same thing as just approving new settlement construction. It's not even the same thing as even retroactively legalizing formerly illegal Israeli outposts. So, that's one big deal. And when we think about what it means to annex a territory or to apply sovereignty, it means to treat the territory the same way that you treat your own sovereign territory. And so, there's one class of these things that Israel did on Sunday that is that. And so even though they did not come out and formally say, "Hey, we're annexing the West Bank," this looks a lot like that in every way, short of announcing it definitively. The second thing they did, which is different, and this is the one that to me is more worrisome, and I think should have the Trump administration more worried, is that despite the fact that the Oslo Accords were meant to be a 5-year interim agreement coming into effect in 1994, they are, of course, still with us. And they've laid out this system in the West Bank of areas A, B, and C. Area C, as presumably everybody knows, 60% of the West Bank fully under Israeli control. Areas A and B under Oslo, and again, this is still in force, are places where the Palestinian Authority has full control over administrative issues. And what the Security Cabinet voted for on Sunday was to say, going forward, Israel now claims the power to enforce construction restrictions or demolish construction in areas A and B, areas where there are only Palestinians and where Israel has said under numerous agreements, including Oslo, it does not have any administrative authority. And the authority it gave itself is to enforce those restrictions if they impede upon historical sites or archaeological sites, or create some sort of environmental hazard, or interfere with water rights, water distribution. These are incredibly broad, and they can basically be used as, as anybody who lives in the United States knows and has dealt with building codes or environmental impact studies. These are the types of things that can be used to basically enforce construction anywhere and everywhere at will. And we're going to start to see that going forward. And this is effectively extending Israeli designs on annexation to areas A and B. We've heard this argument very recently, this notion that when President Trump says Israel can't annex the West Bank, that there's a difference between the West Bank and Judea and Samaria, Yehuda and Shomron. That Judea and Samaria is Area C, or Israeli settlements, and the West Bank is Area A and B, because you don't have any Israelis there. And so there's this argument that's been advanced that when the president says no annexation of the West Bank, he means areas A and B. Well, I don't buy that distinction. I don't think that's what the president actually means, but let's assume for a moment that is indeed what he means. Well, Israel just violated that in a big way. So first of all, if the president who now keeps on saying, including on Tuesday, that he doesn't want Israel annexing the West Bank, if he means it, then it's going to require a conversation with the Israelis. In addition, all of these plans for Gaza, and the things that Don talked about, require, under the president's vision, some functioning Palestinian authority, because the 20-point plan repeatedly talks about the return of the Palestinian Authority to Gaza after a reform process. Well, if you're now extending Israeli control into areas A and B, where under Oslo, the Palestinian Authority is the sovereign for administrative purposes, there's not going to be a Palestinian Authority around for very much longer, and certainly not in any state that gives it the capacity to reform or to take over any functions in Gaza. So in many ways, the fulfillment of the president's vision for Gaza depends on what the Israelis are doing in the West Bank. And what they have now said they're going to do is going to be very damaging. And lastly, when we think about President Trump's wider vision for the Middle East and Saudi normalization and the expansion of the Abraham Accords, we already have seen in all sorts of ways the pullback from the Saudis because of the pressure they're under at home politically, given what Israel is doing. This is only going to make that all the much harder. So I don't know if the president and the prime minister discussed it yesterday, but I certainly hope that they discuss it going forward, because it's going to be very hard for the U.S. to accomplish any of these things, even in a perfect environment. And what the Israelis are now doing is creating an environment that is nowhere near perfect.
Alex, if I could jump in and pick up on something Michael said. We have no idea what happened in the meeting yesterday other than what the two have said. But what's been interesting to me is to watch the arc of President Trump's comments on annexation. When his administration started, I forget whether it was proactive or he got a question, but his reaction was something along the lines of, I don't know, but I'm going to decide in 2 weeks or 30 days, right? He had some artificial time horizon where everyone was wondering, oh, is he going to support annexation? Is he going to green light certain movements? And nothing happened. Who knows if it was a real timeline or just a talking point or whatever came to mind. But over the past few months, we've seen him very clearly say, I do not support Israeli annexation of the West Bank. A couple months ago, that was in reaction to the UAE saying, if Israel formally annexes the West Bank, we are going to pull out of the Abraham Accords. And then suddenly Trump got energized. So I think the United States, or at least the president and his team, have come to understand the linkages that Michael mentioned, where, further tumult, further tension in the West Bank, interruption of tensions in the West Bank is going to harm President Trump's ambition for Gaza and President Trump's ambition for the region. And the comment we saw him say yesterday or the day prior, separate from the meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, is basically, we have enough going on. We have enough to worry about. We don't need the West Bank to be on that list. And that says to me, cool it. Who knows what he said directly to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and we'll see when he goes home over the coming weeks what impact, if any, the conversation they had yesterday has on the policies and the politics that he plays back home. But it seems ardently clear to me that President Trump understands and has got the message. And I too hope he's relaying it to Prime Minister Netanyahu in the things he wants to do for the region.
I want to pause for a moment and remind our audience to please submit any questions that you have in the Q&A box. I'm going to get to them later in the program, but please submit questions. I'm sure that there's a lot on your mind. There's a lot to discuss here. But going back to the question of annexation and these specific measures that were put in place on Sunday by the Security Cabinet, Don, do you have any sense of what the reaction has been on the PA side, and also specifically, how does this stand to impact the Palestinian Authority and its viability in the West Bank on the ground in the coming months?
Okay, so just before the PA, I think, and also with the PA, I think we're all, I don't want to say victims, but I don't have the right word, of the annexation for big legislated, Knesset legislated push for annexation in the spring and summer of 2020, where all the focus was on that. Ultimately, it was averted thanks to the Abraham Accords that, if I remember correctly, suspended annexation for unspecified amount of time. Some reports noted it as 4 years. But the point is that certainly the settlers and their supporters learned the lesson, not necessarily to go for the big legislated annexation, but to basically transform the way with which Israel administers the West Bank under the hood, under the guidance. It's still MOD, the Ministry of Defense. This is still IDF, but under that hood, everything has been civilized, as Michael demonstrated. And they've been able to get a lot of gains under the radar of the key international actors. On the ground and strategically, not related specifically to this move, except for the one that Michael noted the most, what the settlers did over the past 2 decades is basically shift the debate. 2 decades ago, we were in a settlement blocks mode, meaning that all the energy was focused on the relatively big settlement blocks, relatively close to the 1967 line. There are details involved. We won't get into them right now. The settlers understood that this debate lended itself to the partition of the land with small equitable land swaps. And what they did is they shifted the debate into what they term is the fight for Area C, which is spread throughout the West Bank. And all the energy was put into moving away from the blocks debate into and establish facts throughout the West Bank in Area C, basically establishing as many settlements as possible and restricting Palestinian space in Area C. Now they feel like they won that with all the outposts and the farms and the chasing away Palestinian communities in Area C. And now their next target is undoing Oslo, as Michael noted, and undoing areas A and B to the extent that they can. As far as the reaction, very briefly, to me, it was also notable that beyond the regular condemnation of the PA, also a bunch of Arab and Muslim countries put out a pretty strict statement regarding this. Reverting again to what Michael noted and the prospects for further integration, normalization, I think if the trend continues, we may even see some countries pull back or lower the level of normalization and integration that they are involved with Israel. The PA itself, I'll just note, has been in survival mode for the better part of the past 3 years, even dating before that. But certainly now, with all the efforts of this government and the anti-PA elements in it to destabilize it and even bring it to a total downfall using financial and political means, and obviously also the military incursions into Area A that completely delegitimized it.
Dan, I want to follow up with you on the Israeli domestic political angle of all this. You mentioned that there was this shift in the approach by the settlers to advance annexation rather than going from, sort of a major, like pushing for a major annexation announcement, a formal announcement of annexation, to these small steps that de facto change the status of the territory. And we've also discussed how there's been a shift in the president's view on annexation from not really having a stance, potentially, having someone in his administration supporting it, to now I'm outright saying I'm opposed to West Bank annexation. Israel shouldn't annex the West Bank, especially because it's going to be such a major setback for everything that he's trying to accomplish. Nonetheless, it seems like the Israeli right is sticking by President Trump. And, I saw a poll recently by, I think it was the Jewish People Policy Institute, that showed really broad support on the Israeli right among members of Netanyahu's camp for the president, in spite of this clear divergence in Israeli policy, or this divergence between the U.S. stance and the Israeli government. And, of course, Bibi has invested for years in portraying himself as close to President Trump. So how do you anticipate this playing out as we now head into an election season?
Look, by and large, Israelis love Trump. He passes this intuitive test of him being pro-Israel, that he loves Israel. Also, obviously, he very much helped secure the release of the remaining captives. But no matter how much he disappoints, as for the settlers and their supporters, no matter how much he disappoints them, I'm recalling Trump's idea to remove all the Palestinians from Gaza, which gained a lot of support and enthusiasm, mainly in the settler community, and then now with the 20-point plan, totally reversed course. But no matter how much he disappoints them, he doesn't hurt them, and they intuitively see that he's pro-Israel. On top of that, settlers play the long game. They've always played the long game, which gives them a lot of resiliency to withstand whatever setbacks are coming their way from any kind of U.S. administrations. So in that regard, ultimately, the politics of this will fall in some, but both explicit and implicit communication messages that Trump communicates to the Israeli people. I'm sorry, to the Israeli people at large, and specifically to the right here in Netanyahu's base. As long as it sticks by him, that will play to his favor. If at any point President Trump decides to either explicitly endorse somebody else or even just him, that may affect the right coalition and its potential voters in a certain way. Remains to be seen how.
I also think it's important to note that the settler movement is not, their views are not necessarily the broadly popular views of the Israeli right. It's not that on the Israeli right they're opposing what the settlement movement is doing, but President Trump's popularity extends well beyond the settlers. And I think for most Israelis, they look at the fact that he's the U.S. president who finally hit Iran's nuclear sites and participated with Operation Midnight Hammer in June, and of course he has constantly said all the right things about Hamas and the hostages and Israel's right to defend itself. And so there's all the stuff from the first term as well, with recognition of Jerusalem and recognition of sovereignty over the Golan Heights and moving the embassy. So these things are all broadly popular. And with regard to his relationship with the prime minister, since we've been on this webinar, I see that President Trump gave some remarks to the White House press pool where he said that President Herzog should be ashamed of himself for not having yet pardoned Prime Minister Netanyahu. So clearly he's still in Netanyahu's corner, and it's a powerful element for Netanyahu and for the Israeli right more widely.
Wow, that's certainly very striking.
Breaking. We love to break news on these webinars.
The best webinars are always the ones where we are following the events in real time.
Yes, the best webinars are the ones where the panelists aren't paying attention and are actually on Twitter.
I want to turn on that note to one aspect of the Gaza reconstruction day after emerging situation that we haven't discussed yet, which is the NCAG, the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, which is really the only Palestinian element of this post-war Gaza architecture that Trump has dreamed up. Right now, apparently, they're just sitting in a hotel in Cairo, from what I hear, not actually, able to influence on the events on the ground directly in Gaza, and Israel has refused to let them in. Do we anticipate that changing in the coming weeks? To what extent is that actually going to thwart Trump's ability to achieve his vision in Gaza? Is the Board of Peace able to do anything in reality without the actual Palestinian element of this architecture in place, able to advance governance, advance a day after governance infrastructure on the ground in Gaza? That can be to any of you.
I'll just note that all this robust international mechanism is quite impressive. I think the main value of it is, I don't want to say locking in, because he can turn away at any moment. But attaching Trump personally to this and mobilizing political value. But the reality on the ground is you have two key actors that have veto power over the ability to move forward, and that is Israel and Hamas. And so the ultimate test is, can you move them in a way that makes space for the NCAG to come in from Cairo through the Rafah crossing without going through the Palestinian militia and through Israeli inspection in a humiliating way that will leave them with zero credibility and legitimacy? Can they get into Gaza? Can they set up in Gaza? Can they staff up? And can they deliver some very quick wins? If I understand correctly, the Board of Peace is trying, or the executive board is trying to engage and see if both Israel and Hamas will move enough and allow this to take hold. And the coming weeks will be, I think, pretty dramatic in this regard.
I would add, with every passing day that the NCAG is not in Gaza and is not delivering services, Hamas further cements its own control. And you have both Hamas there as the only governing authority in the red zone or old Gaza, depending what nomenclature you use to describe it. And there's no alternative mechanism. So I think, with all the challenges that Dan laid out, it's critical that they are able to show presence, show face, show up in Gaza and deliver some services soon, noting that that's incredibly difficult. You asked about the different layers in the Board of Peace. It gives me some solace, understanding that the NCAG, the Executive Committee, Nikolai Mladenov, who's, I don't think High Commissioner is exactly his title, but in charge of the Executive Committee and the implementation, that they're able to operate almost regardless of what happens with the Board of Peace. I think we've seen a long list of countries sign up for the Board of Peace. Not very many countries deliver anything as part of their signature or their agreement to be on the Board of Peace. And it'll be interesting to see what happens next week when this Board of Peace meeting is scheduled to happen in Washington. As of yesterday or today, there were very few countries had reported agreeing to show up. And this is fraught for a lot of them. It's political at home. It's political with respect to the relationship with the United States. It's political with respect to fulfilling Trump's wishes and wanting to stay on his good side. But our conversation a few minutes back about annexation, I have to imagine, weighs heavily on some of these countries, particularly the Arab and Muslim countries that Dan mentioned, came out pretty ardently against Israeli moves in the West Bank a couple days ago, and understand that they're connected to Gaza for what happens in Gaza, but also for their own political dynamics in their respective countries. So I see the Board of Peace and them becoming a productive entity as equally, if not more challenging, as the NCAG and the Executive Committee being productive. But I don't think the latter depends on the Board of Peace, which gives me more hope for productivity on the ground.
Interesting. In terms of, so if the NCAG is not actually able to get on the ground in Gaza, with all this uncertainty about the Board of Peace, with many of the countries that have been invited not actually having signed on, I mean, we'll see next week what comes out of this inaugural meeting in Washington. I mean, it looks like there's a considerable chance that Israel just takes it upon itself to disarm Hamas unilaterally, as we have a question about this in the Q&A. Is that something that we're seeing is increasingly likely, that Israel just takes it upon itself to cross the yellow line and extend its occupation to the entire Gaza Strip? This is one of the scenarios, Don, that you discussed in the new policy report that we published today. So I'm curious, what do you think that could look like? Is that something that you're seeing as likely? Would an operation to cross the yellow line be more similar to what we saw during the height of the Gaza war, like just entering the populated areas and leaving? Or are there serious talks in Israel about a prolonged occupation of the entire Strip?
I'll be very brief because I saw Michael unmuting himself, getting ready to jump in. I'll just note it's certainly, on the table, this effort. I just don't think we're there yet. I think the U.S. administration, Trump himself, certainly Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are still convinced there's a lot more effort to be done in terms of getting an agreement with Hamas. I'll just note that if we get there, and if the Americans green light, coercive military ground maneuver to try and disarm Hamas by force, two things. A, I think that window will be limited. We're going into election seasons here. You also have your elections there, and I don't think the president who effectively declared the war over and peace in the Middle East here already would have a lot of patience for a prolonged military campaign. On the ground strategically, while there is a theory of the case, and we laid out in the report that you can degrade Hamas significantly in Red Gaza, in the area that it controls, and get a significant military achievement there, there is no exit strategy. The risk of prolonged open-ended occupation, insurgency, and ultimately also rearmament is still very high and costly. International legitimacy will be absolutely zero, no prospects for normalization on anything of that sort. So the strategic costs will be extremely high.
Yeah, I was going to say very similar to what Dan said. I think that you see chatter in the Israeli press about preparations for the IDF to go back into the red zone and disarm Hamas. Ultimately, I don't see any world in which that happens unless Trump says unambiguously, that's fine with me. And he has put so much of his personal backing and prestige behind the idea, including just yesterday, right? His all caps, we have peace in the Middle East, behind this idea that, the war is over and everything's going great and we have peace and we now have this board of peace and, they're going to reportedly when they meet next week in DC, they're going to announce a reconstruction fund. And I'm sure they'll announce formally that the Indonesians and maybe somebody else is joining the International Stabilization Force. He's put so much effort into constructing this set of institutions, and putting his name on them, in some cases, literally putting his name on them. It's hard for me to see a world in which he says to the prime minister, yeah, sure, go back in, restart the war. I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I also find that hard to believe. We also have a question from the Q&A about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, the NGOs that are active on the ground. How have we seen that situation on the ground in Gaza develop since the ceasefire took hold? What is going on in Red Gaza versus east of the Yellow Line in the area under Israeli control? Is the situation, I mean, obviously there's a lot of relief and the relief and reconstruction effort that needs to happen is significant and considerable, but what is the situation right now for ordinary Gazans? Don, do you have any sense, or Rachel?
I'll chime in quickly and then I'll let Dan
Okay.
add. My understanding is that it's very uneven. The humanitarian situation in different places is better and worse. There is more food than there was pre-ceasefire. In some places, people are able to go into stores and there are kiosks where there is a regular market. In other cases, folks are dependent on aid packages, but aid packages are able to get in. We've seen for the last few months the CMCC, the Civil Military Coordination Center that the United States set up in Kiryat Gat in Israel and includes both U.S. military, Israeli COGAT, and other foreign officials. Their primary effort has been on getting humanitarian aid into Gaza at the level and numbers that were promised as part of Trump's 20-point plan. Medical care is a little bit better than it was. Still not great, but again, more things are able to get in. There's a constant tension over dual use items, which contribute in some cases to medical care, but even more so to shelter. And in conversations I've had recently, that is the most challenging piece of just emergency humanitarian assistance, where people are living in flimsy tents or in rubbled buildings, and it's winter. So the rain, the cold, the tents are being washed away. There's very little sanitation. So if you're just sitting in water, in addition to being freezing cold, it's not great for sanitation. And there are ongoing efforts to try and improve that, negotiate over what materials can be let in, what is temporary shelter versus more enduring shelter. Different countries are contributing to this, the Egyptians, the Emiratis, and other actors at the CMCC. So what I have been hearing from a couple folks who work in this space is it's better. It's still uneven and it's not great, but it's certainly better than it was. Dan, I'll let you fill in anything else.
Two things that are also in play is, one, there's a whole issue of what international NGOs are allowed to operate in the Strip. Israel now demands, if I understand correctly, that they, as part of the registration process, they submit the list of their employees. If I'm not mistaken, MSF refused to do so, and therefore they are relating to the healthcare issue that Rachel noted. They are, as of now, if I understand correctly, not allowed into the Strip. So there are all kinds of issues with that. One last thing is an interesting experiment is happening in Green Gaza, or on the part of Gaza under Israeli control, where Israel is trying to mobilize the construction of if you would, humanitarian city or a camp, a community in Rafah, with the idea being that this will be the pilot for creating a new reality in New Gaza that will attract Palestinians into it. Vetted Palestinians, they'll have to go through biometric check-in, and they'll be moving there and creating pressure on Hamas as the population moves more and more into Green Gaza. So far, there've been infrastructure work to clear rubble there, but everything that has to do with the construction and mobilizing real money to create that community and many others that would ultimately need to be to scale this up, so far is lagging way behind.
If I can add one point, just elaborating on what Dan mentioned with registered and unregistered NGOs, there's a list of international NGOs who are not currently registered for a number of reasons, including what Dan mentioned related to MSF, who the Israeli government has said after March 1st, if you are not registered, you have to leave. And it's unclear what will happen to Palestinian employees who are in Gaza and live in Gaza of these organizations, or the international employees who would otherwise live outside Gaza. Will they be allowed to stay in Israel? Will they allowed to continue operating remotely? But for NGOs who are not registered and don't want to register, that's among the challenges they're looking at over the next couple of weeks too.
We have a question in the Q&A about, I think it's referring to anti-Hamas militias in Gaza, and that is kind of a solution to Gaza's security after an IDF operation in the Red Zone. We've seen this tried by Israel in the past, especially during this war with the Yasser Abu Shabab militia, and a couple others. Is this a viable path forward for Gaza? Dan, I see you making a face about this. So
no, I'm saying I could read Michael's column, but we have Michael here, so please go ahead.
Michael, go for it.
I'll quickly say the answer is no. We've had this natural experiment. There was an IDF operation targeting Hamas for 2.5 years in Gaza, or 2 years in Gaza, and at the end of it, the IDF withdrew after literally battling Hamas for 2 years and killing tens of thousands of Hamas fighters and bombing many Hamas locations and destroying infrastructure so that Hamas couldn't use it afterward. And as soon as the IDF withdrew, Hamas routed the anti-Hamas militias within the span of about a week. So I'm not sure why anybody thinks that replaying this, doing the exact same thing over again, will somehow create a situation where the anti-Hamas militias all of a sudden are able to go in and rout Hamas. Let's remember, the anti-Hamas militias, they're not, Hamas is an actual militia. These guys are largely criminal gangs and smugglers who, we call them a militia because they have some weapons, but they spent most of their time, both before October 7th and since October 7th, running smuggling operations into Gaza. It's basically a criminal gang. So I don't know why anybody thinks that they have this enormous capacity and capability of challenging Hamas, particularly when they also don't have any popular support, right? It would be like saying, hey, these guys who've been running a black market, who are probably pretty unpopular among Palestinians, let's put them in charge because they're going to do a better job and they're going to somehow have more legitimacy. It's an insane policy to pursue.
Michael, one other question for you about Turkey and Qatar, which is an angle that we haven't discussed here, and it seems like this is one of the several divergences that has emerged between the U.S. and Israel when it comes to Gaza's post-war future. With Trump, of course, being very close to the regimes in Ankara and Doha, and Israel increasingly wary of, especially Turkey's role, not only in Gaza but also in other arenas like Syria, in this weird kind of ambivalent, I guess you could say, relationship that Israel has with the Qataris, both in cooperating with them in the past in Gaza and the extent to which the Qataris have even infiltrated the prime minister's office in this ongoing scandal that has been roiling the Israeli domestic political discourse for the past several months. how is this being navigated between the two sides? Do you anticipate these two actors having an actual tangible role in Gaza's reconstruction and stabilization?
This is indeed a big difference between the United States and Israel. According to press reports, the Turkish and Qatari representatives on the Board of Peace are going to be here next week for the inaugural Board of Peace meeting. I suspect that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not. We'll see. I suppose if President Trump told him he has to show up, then he'll show up. But I think he's unlikely to, precisely for that reason, among others. And the Israelis wanted to keep the Turks and Qataris out of everything, and that was not successful. President Trump has now said a number of times how much he likes and trusts President Erdogan, and he's also explicitly said, he likes Prime Minister Netanyahu, he likes President Erdogan, and because both of them are his friends, the two of them are going to have to get along. I think that's his position. So, we see them now involved, certainly at a high level. And I think it's very unlikely when push comes to shove that they are kept out of Gaza reconstruction entirely. A, because the president likes them. B, because the Qataris already have all sorts of links inside of Gaza. C, the Turks are maybe better than anyone else in the world at quickly jetting into post-conflict zones and seeding those places with Turkish firms and Turkish merchants, and really setting up commerce for Turkish industry. They also, this has been their argument. They also have an enormous amount of peacekeeping experience, which makes sense because they're the second largest NATO country and they're willing to go into places. So, they have all these arguments for why they should be there. I think that the Israelis, I don't think the Qataris actually want to put boots on the ground, and I think the Israelis are going to fight tooth and nail to keep Turkish boots on the ground out of Gaza, or keep Turkish boots off the ground, as it were. But I don't think it's going to be possible to deny them any and every role inside of Gaza, particularly given the historic Qatari role in Gaza, and under under Netanyahu governments. They have experience there. They obviously have tight connections with Hamas. Both countries exercise leverage on Hamas, and so if you're going to have any sort of successful DDR process, that's going to require the Qataris and Turks to exercise their leverage. And I don't know why they would do that if the message is, hey, you guys have to exercise your leverage on Hamas to comply, but then afterwards we're cutting you out entirely. That's not a thing that's going to work. So I think we're going to have this continual tug of war between Trump and Netanyahu over the extent of Qatari and Turkish involvement, but I don't think that there's going to be a way to keep them out completely.
If I could add, watching what's happening as Michael described and what's happening elsewhere in the region, there's a complicated web of tugs of war, or webs of sort of debates over who's playing what role in all sorts of countries around Israel's border, to include Syria, where Turkey has also played a role and wants to play a role, and Israel would like to keep them at least playing less of a role, if not out entirely. And meanwhile, President Trump has this relationship with Erdogan where he sees him as a partner, and he has said on multiple occasions, I like him, I'm impressed by him, he's accomplished great things, and so clearly wants Turkey to play a role. Just today, the United States announced that CENTCOM announced that they are pulling troops out of Syria. And a small outpost where there have been a relatively small number of troops since the counter-ISIS campaign that were there to support the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Syrian Kurdish forces who worked in partnership with the United States during the counter-ISIS campaign, who the Turks now are advocating hard be integrated into the Syrian military, not have the special treatment that the United States has given them for a long time. I have no idea the reason for this happening now, but the first thing that came to mind is, what is Trump getting for doing this? That there's got to be some deal behind the scenes, whether it has to do with Gaza or the Board of Peace or Syria, I don't know. But Trump fancies himself a deal maker. And to his credit, I think his team is trying to pursue a range of deals across the region, some of which are entirely separate, some of which are interrelated. So this one in particular was one that I expect is related to something having to do with Turkey, even though I have not been on Twitter during this webinar, so I don't yet know what it might be.
Rachel, I want to ask you also about Lebanon and what's going on there. Is there a potential for this to become an active front again? Obviously, Hezbollah hasn't gone away. It still is a dominant force in Lebanese society, and despite maybe despite the efforts of people like Prime Minister Nawaf Salam and President Joseph Aoun, they haven't succeeded in completely fulfilling their obligations in the ceasefire. But meanwhile, you have the Israelis who continue to hold these 5 points, as far as I believe, or as far as I know, in southern Lebanon. So that would technically make them in violation as well. Is this something that we're concerned about heading into the coming months, potentially in parallel to another round with Iran?
Yeah, I mean, I know we only have a couple of minutes, so I'll give a very short answer and then hope to have a whole conversation on the topic another time. I think this is another situation where President Trump in the United States and Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel have different views and probably different preferences. For President Trump, Lebanon has been another arena where he sees the potential for a deal. Following Israel's campaign against Hezbollah, the Lebanese government was able to sort of stand on its own 2 feet for the first time in a while, form a government, and the ceasefire that was reached that the U.S. facilitated between Israel and Lebanon included this mechanism for disarming Hezbollah, commitments to disarm Hezbollah, commitments for Israel to withdraw, a number of things that haven't yet been fulfilled but are still being worked on. Just yesterday or the day prior, CENTCOM, so the U.S. military, put out a statement praising the Lebanese armed forces for their successful efforts to disarm and rubble some tunnels that Hezbollah had been using, which said to me that they are trying to prop up the Lebanese armed forces and show that they're trying and they're capable. It's an open question whether the Lebanese armed forces or the Lebanese government is actually fully capable of disarming Hezbollah. They have been a partner for the United States for a long time, and the Trump administration has openly questioned whether security assistance is something that we should be giving countries. For a while, they cut off the security assistance to the Lebanese armed forces, then they restarted some of it. It's my view that if you want a country to do something and they are not capable of doing so themselves, it's better for us to help them. Otherwise, someone else like Iran or Russia or China will come in and do so. That's not necessarily the view of this administration. So I'm skeptical that the Lebanese armed forces are going to be able to fully disarm Hezbollah on their own. And it's an open question how long the Israelis will wait, and whether there is potential for some sort of economic or diplomatic deal to be reached between the two of them, or they decide that they have to go in and go after Hezbollah again first.
Thanks, Rachel. Just in the minute that we have left, I want to turn to you, Michael, to close us out. Obviously, there's a lot of attention on the issue of Gaza's rehabilitation on the day after from the Trump administration. What do you think is kind of the best case scenario for how things could play out in the coming months, even if that might not necessarily be the most likely scenario?
Yeah, the best case scenario would be that the NCAG gets into Gaza, is able to actually establish some mechanism for service provision and basic governance that the GDR process, as outlined in the paper written by Don and Celine, starts to get underway, and that there are actually reconstruction funds that get pledged at this Board of Peace meeting next week that can start to get used in areas where the NCAG establishes control, with hopefully a Palestinian force coming to deploy not far behind in these new areas that are devoid of Hamas. That to me is the best case scenario. Is it likely? I guess we'll see. I don't know that I'd be putting any money down on it, but that would be the best case scenario.
Well, we'll just have to see how things play out in the coming months. But I want to thank all three of you for joining us, and to all of Israel Policy Forum supporters who are with us on today's call. I invite the rest of you to join Israel Policy Forum's family of donors by visiting israelpolicyforum.org/support. There will be a recording of this webinar posted on the briefings page of our website. I also encourage you to subscribe to the podcast, Israel Policy Pod, sign up to receive the weekly Koplow column in your email inbox, and visit the Israel Policy Forum website for more insight and analysis from our team of experts. Please stay tuned for an announcement regarding the next Israel Policy Forum webinar. And until then, thank you for tuning in.